Good evening. I am Florence Reed, currently serving as an elder here at First Reformed Church. And in that role, I also serve as chairperson of the Adult Education and Nurture Committee, who is very happy to be the sponsor of this evening's program. This church has had a very long history of being involved in various forms of activism within its neighborhood, within its community, and even on a national and international scale. With that in mind, it is really appropriate that we gather for tonight's important topic. In preparing for the topic tonight, I couldn't help but think of the reason we're here, and it has to do with the topic of war. And as I look around the room tonight, amongst those who I know are members of this church and those who are friends and visitors to this church, I know instinctively all of us in some way have been touched by the experience, an experience over time, a lost family member, a disabled family member or neighbor, working side by side with a conscientious objector who is doing alternate service in Schenectady, walking the streets, carrying signs, sitting in the doorway of some important building. We have done all of that. We have seen all of that. And our motivation, I believe, has always been to reach for something better, to reach for peace. And that's why we gather this evening. In sharing those experiences, or reminding you of those experiences, I chose a meditation for this evening from a very unlikely source. It ain't nothing but a heartbreaker, friend only to the undertaker. Whoa. Peace, love, and understanding. Tell me, is there no place for me today? They say we must fight to keep our freedom, but Lord knows there's got to be a better way. That may sound familiar to many of us in this room as a very well-known, or part of a very well-known anti-war anthem for the Vietnam War. That was written in 1970. And the year before, we were all hearing, all we are saying is give peace a chance. With that, I want to give additional special thanks to Reverend Daniel Carlson, who is the minister assigned to the Adult Ed and Nurture Committee. He and I worked closely together on arranging this event with others. I'll mention them in a moment. But I also want to give very special thanks to the committee members of Adult Ed who graciously allowed Daniel and me to kind of work in advance of getting their acknowledgement that this would be a good thing for us to do. So I'm very glad for their ongoing support. I also want to acknowledge the presence this evening, the great presence of Reverend Martel Spaniolo, who is, I can't exactly say new minister any longer because he's now been here longer than a year, but we are very proud and pleased to have him join us as well this evening. I also want to acknowledge Reverend John Parlberg, who truly is an advocate for peace, has been so for a very long time, and is past minister of First Church of Albany. This evening, we are being joined by two solid voices on the topic of trying to reach peace in the Middle East. I would go on and say that as a student of history, one of the things that I also know to be true about that struggle between war and peace is that the event right now in the Middle East started on October 7th, and yet the struggle for peace, the struggle for a solution in the Middle East extends back to 1948. And in fact, that same struggle extends back to World War I. And it extends beyond that. So I've kind of coined my own phrase for it now, is that many of the experiences we have in terms of conflict have a genealogy, have a family tree. This evening's speakers are Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. She serves as Executive Director for Churches for the Middle East Peace. She holds several master's degrees and earned her doctorate in American history in a minor in Middle East Studies at the University of California, Davis. Her dissertation was on the history of the American Protestant Church in Israel and Palestine. Joining her this evening is Tamar Haddad. She serves as coordinator at Churches for Middle East Peace, Women's Empowerment Program, and Still We Rise. She is based in Jerusalem. She was hugely impacted by her involvement in many phenomenal leadership programs. And I understand, if I have the order correctly, she is the person we will hear from first. I have one other housekeeping chore. It's been a long time since I've done something that resembles training. So, a little orientation. There's a water fountain outside the doors that you entered. There are bathrooms also out there, little important details related to that. And also, you may have noticed that on two sides, you'll find flip chart information. The one on my right is the address in case you, by the end of this evening, would like to make a general gift to CMEP. There's the address to which you can send your contribution. And on my left, by their display table, is the address and way to mark your check if you wish to make a contribution to the honorarium to cover the expenses related to the tour that these two individuals are part of. With that, let me turn the floor over to Tamar Haddad. Welcome to Schenectady.
Hello, everyone, and I don't know, do you hear me well? Okay. Do I? Okay. So, let me see if I can get this one out. We're getting there? Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for lending us your listening ears. I just wonder how many of you have been to Palestine, Israel, the Holy Land? Just raise your hands, okay? That's a big number. And how many of you know what occupation means? Okay, good. I don't have to start from scratch. So I grew up in Jerusalem, and as you may know, being in Jerusalem can guarantee me more privileges than other Palestinians. And I'm given a blue ID, meaning I have more access to movement than other Palestinians. I can cross the checkpoint, I can go to Israel and Palestine. I have access to electricity, water, and all of that. Not always, but definitely more than the rest of the Palestinians I know. Then there's Gaza, and Gaza is its own world. I have never been to Gaza. I cannot enter Gaza. I know you can if you applied or something. I know it's possible for you. It's never possible for me to enter. And it's also not possible for Gazans to leave Gaza unless there's like, coordination with governments and all of that. And sometimes they get to leave, but guess what? They don't go to the rest of Palestine or Israel. I meet my Gazan friends in the States. And the first time I also interacted with both Gazans and Israelis was actually in Boston of this year. I grew up in Jerusalem where the majority, or like half is Palestinian, half is Israeli. I never had a meaningful connection with an Israeli there. And if anything, in my head, as a Palestinian, like an Israeli is someone who's holding a rifle at checkpoints, in a military tank, and all of that. But I just wanted to say that I kind of wish I never made those Gazan friends, because I know that what they're going through. So one of them, who's a very dear friend of mine, was supposed to marry in November, and his house was completely demolished. He was very excited to get married, be in that house. He sent us a picture of his house. It's literally just rubbles. That was in November. Recently, I saw a video of him, and because of the lack of food, he's in northern Gaza, and because of the lack of food, he got nothing to eat, and his face just looks very skinny, like I've never seen it before. And this is just one person. I know many others there who don't have anything right now, who moved from one place to another. I know many Christians there who had to leave and found ways to leave. And we're losing the Christian popularity in Gaza and in Palestine right now because of everything that is going on. And yeah, my experience as a Palestinian was always hard. Like, I went to school in Bethlehem University. I don't know if you've seen it or been there, but I had to cross the checkpoint every day. And every day, I had to be taken out of the bus, whereas if you were on the bus with me, you could stay on that bus. I had to step outside, have my ID checked, and all of that. And I remember one time, I had an American with me, who's my godfather somehow. But he told me I was shook when I was on that bus one time, because I saw that there were children on the bus. And it was so normal for the Israeli soldier to enter the bus and just like point the rifle at those kids in the bus. And for him, it was shocking. And for me, I was like, that's weird to you, because like that's literally every day for me. And Reverend May was with us in Palestine and Israel back in January, and we were trying to enter one of the villages. Now, if you don't know, the West Bank turned into Gaza in a way after October the 7th, in the sense that there was blockades around every city, plus settler attacks around every city or village. So people were not able to exit or enter the cities and the villages, and people were locked in their homes. I know I was locked in my house for 3 months. But we were going to one of the villages, and that was in January, 4 months after October the 7th. And we were trying to enter, so we'd look at every possible entrance, and we'd go from one to the next, to the third, and then go back from the beginning, try the same thing over and over again. And then this military jeep saw us, and they stopped us and asked, what are you doing? Now, of course, Palestinian me, I try to hide in the back because like I would avoid this situation at all costs. And I was trying to tell May that, like, May, we shouldn't do this. And she was like, we're fine, we're fine. And I'm like, okay, I'll just hide in the back. And she talked to them, it went smooth, but they said, we'll lead you into the village. So they took us through the main entry point. And by the end, once they got us, and we were very scared, like we did not want to enter the village after an Israeli military truck when we were meeting Palestinian friends. So they stopped us and said, just be careful. Are you sure you want to go there? If anything bad happens to you, here's my number. So there's a lot of horrible things that happen, but I can keep going forever, honestly. And there's always a story. One time my uncle was he was like when somebody points a gun at him because he refused to open the window at a checkpoint. And he almost lost his life and his children were in the back of the car. The amount of stories Palestinians have are endless. You can talk to any Palestinian, ask them about anything, and their stories would never end. But nothing is compared to what is happening in Gaza. And funny enough, my friend in Gaza tells me, Tamar, don't even compare your struggle to mine. We're both struggling. Yes, it's different, but it's not normal. The reason why I'm saying all of this is to encourage you to act and do something. You have the power, whereas I or other Palestinians don't. I'm not supposed to post, or I'm not allowed, it's very dangerous for me to post. It's very dangerous for me to talk to you right now. And I try to hide it, and I try to avoid publicity because we cannot share. Back home, if you post something online, I'm sure you know, immediately detention. So I can't, but you can, and your role is very important. You have a huge role to play. Either, I don't want to go into the details, but maybe at the end we'll share. So thank you for everything you do, and I'm gonna turn it over to May.
Thank you. Tamar is a gift to us. I was introduced to her. How many of you have heard or met or know Reverend Dr. Munter Itzhak? Do you know of his work? He's a dear friend, and I was sitting in his office, and we had this ministry that was called End Still We Rise, working to empower women throughout the Arab world and Palestine specifically. And we'd been looking for a leader for years, and he said, I know a young woman, and she's incredible, and she's written a book about women and feminism in Palestine. I said, feminism in Palestine? What are you talking about? He said, she's looking for a job, and she's been working with us since, and she's such a gift to us. So I'm grateful to be traveling with her these few days. I wanted to tell you a story about the first time I went into Gaza. I've been in a few times, and I previously, in my former life, well, I'm still a pastor, but in my former life, I served in a local church. And most of my work focused on social justice. I thought that I was going to do work on domestic social reform. You know, I had a book the very first time I went to the Holy Land that was coming out on global social justice issues. And then I was introduced to the story of Palestine and the Palestinian people. And the rest is kind of history. And the first time I went into Gaza was probably 2000, 2001. And I can remember coming over the hill and seeing the Mediterranean, and the sun was setting. And it was so stunning and so beautiful. If you did not know where you were, you might have thought that you were on a coastline of the Mediterranean in like the south of Italy. Now, this was 2020, so most or much of Gaza had been rebuilt after the 2014 war. That main street along the waterfront, it looked really good, at least on the surface. Now, what you didn't know by eyesight was that every day, tens of thousands of polluted water was being dumped into the Mediterranean because there were not sanitation facilities. What you didn't know, if you didn't know the statistics, was that 99.9% of the water in Gaza, all before October, was not potable. What you didn't know, if you hadn't gone through all the checkpoints that I had to go through to get in, including the Erez checkpoint, right, was that Gaza had been under a blockade at that point for already a dozen years. Are these all things you're familiar with? The blockade on Gaza began after 2005. And there's something that over the last, I don't do math very well, so 16 plus years, I know it was at least 17, 18, right? There's a list about what's allowed into Gaza and what's not. The list is called the dual use list. And anything that can be used potentially for nefarious purposes is put on that dual list, that dual use list. Cement, metal, electronics, cilantro. Literally, cilantro was on the dual use list. I'm not telling you why. I don't know why. After the 2014 war, which we thought was utterly devastating, I was doing advocacy then, and I can remember going before world leaders and Washington, D.C., and members of the U.S. government, and I can remember saying, stop the war, because so many children have died. 5,000 children had died, and it was unfathomable that 5,000 children had died. Stop the war on Gaza. 2014. Do you know how many children in Gaza have died today? More than 14,000 children have died in Gaza today. So this was back in 2014. And one of the things that got put on the dual use list, this was still 2020, so years after the war, when there was still rebuilding and so many people had already been displaced from their homes, was wood products that were being used to rebuild their homes. The wood was considered too thick. It could be used for nefarious purposes. So whoever writes these restrictions within the Israeli government, made the width of the wood half of what it had been, so that the wood had to be thinner so that it could not be used for nefarious purposes. And the development agency that was hosting me said, it's much harder to build temporary houses with this wood, it's too thin. And then a few months later, I don't know if it was 6 months later or maybe it was even a year later, what went on the dual use list was that wood that was half the thickness, it was deemed too thick. And so the width of that wood became that one had to be cut in half. And then the wood became so thin that guess what the development agency had to do before they could build? They had to glue the wood together. This was just a small glimpse of what Gaza was like before October 7th. So then October 7th happens, and on October 7th, you know the story. Hamas and other militant groups attacked South Israel in more than 30 different locations, across the separation between Gaza and Israel. More than 1,200 people were killed, more than 240 people taken hostage. And it was a brutally violent day. And I do think it's critically important that we understand that that day was incredibly traumatic, particularly for people who lost loved ones or who had loved ones taken hostage that day. Loved ones who now, 193 days later, who still are waiting for hostages to be returned home. And we've been since day one calling for the return of hostages. So October 7th happens. Many would say that it was the most atrocious attack against Jews since the Holocaust. It's important to understand the attack was against many Jewish people who were Israeli, but Palestinian citizens of Israel were killed too. Muslims were killed that day. Internationals were killed that day. It was an atrocious day where many people died. And immediately thereafter, the Israeli government said, no water, no food, no gas, no electricity at all until every single hostage returns home. This punishment was imposed on all 2.3 million people living in Gaza. That is not only illegal by international law, that's immoral. Turning off water for more than 2 million people. And in large part, the world was silent. And that was day one. And we're on day 193. And now, months later, more than 6 months later, the death toll in Gaza is more than 34,000 people, more than 70,000 people injured. And we're still having debates about whether or not a ceasefire is legitimate. And when you call for a comprehensive ceasefire, I went on Sky News. Have you heard of Sky News? It was actually in Arabic. I don't speak Arabic. It was Sky News Arabia. I hope they translated fairly. And I didn't know it was a debate. It was a debate with someone from the Heritage Foundation. We've been calling for a comprehensive ceasefire since day one. That means the laying down, it means everyone who has been engaged in violence laying down their weapons. It means Hamas, lay down your weapons. It means Israel, stop bombing Gaza. Stop the ground invasion into Gaza. And the person that I was debating said, you are pro-Hamas. And I said, what are you talking about? I said, what are you talking about? He said, you're calling for a ceasefire. I said, I am calling for the end of death. Stop killing. Stop killing. That's what we're calling for. Stop killing. Do you know, it has gotten so bad in Gaza that mothers will write the name of their child with their registration number on their leg so that when they're found dead, people will know who they are. And the President of the United States had the audacity at whatever month it was to say, we question these numbers. I actually have the document from the Palestinian Authority, which I don't know how, it was from the authority in Gaza, and then it got to, I don't know how. Anyway, I have the document. The number at that point was 9,000 deaths. It's more than 200 pages long, and it has the name of every single person, where they're from, and their number. And here in the United States, 6 months later, it's like we're out to a picnic, and the vast majority of bombs that are being dropped on Gaza, guess where they're actually being made? Here in the United States. And so, if I'm really honest about this moment, one day, history is going to look back and say, what happened? What happened, and how did the world respond to Gaza in this moment? And where were Christians who called themselves followers of the Prince of Peace? And what did they do to support peace? Because if you really care about the future of Israel, even Chuck Schumer is the highest ranking Jewish official ever elected in American history. And Chuck Schumer is saying, if Israel keeps doing what it's doing, it has become the most severe, the most significant pariah state. The future of Israel, Israel is in danger because it is becoming so isolated on the global stage. And so if you care about the future of Israel, you have to care about the future of Palestinians. I want us to win the moral argument because Palestinian people, because of the humanity of Palestinian people. Have any of you ever been into a Palestinian home? The hospitality of Palestinian people? I have had tea in a Palestinian home that was demolished 4 times because it was built on the route of the separation barrier. And so literally sitting on top of rubble, a family that had absolutely nothing, I have been served, literally out of nothing, I have been served with the most robust hospitality you can ever imagine. I want people to care about Palestinians because Palestinians are beautiful and kind and wonderful and have such a vibrant culture. I would love to win the argument on the moral argument that thou shalt not kill. You should have heard of that before, right? We're not winning the moral argument. I've been to the White House, technically the EEOB, the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, numerous times. I mean, we've met with the White House, 24 times since October. We are not winning the moral argument. So if we can't win the argument morally, what's the pragmatic argument? You think Israel is becoming a pariah state? Do you want to know the reputation of the United States right now in the Middle East? I was just there for a couple of weeks in January. 10-year-old children, not because their parents are challenging them to, are boycotting McDonald's. They're boycotting McDonald's of their own volition. It used to be when you travel all over the Arab world, and I have alone as a woman without issue, it used to be people would say, we don't hate Americans, we hate your government. Now people are saying, how in the world can you let your government do such horrific things? And why are you silent in the midst of a genocide? Where were you? Regardless of what you call what's happening in Gaza, regardless of what you call it, the average amount of Palestinians being killed every day has been 180 Palestinians a day. That means a Palestinian is killed every 8 minutes. And how are we called to respond? I believe at a minimum, we're called to say enough. Enough, there has to be a better way. I'll close by saying I do think Israel has an existential crisis. And one of the dynamics that has happened as a result of October 7th, Jewish people, a girlfriend of mine told me this, who's Israeli. She's an Israeli human rights activist, but she said, you're taught your whole life as a Jewish Israeli that people are trying to kill you. And she actually was supposed to serve in the Israeli army during the Second Intifada. And she said, you're taught your whole life people are trying to kill you. And then she said, at that time, you'd walk out your door and people were, right? Suicide bombing was something that was happening during that time period. And she said that was a part of the reality. And now she actually did not serve in the Israeli army. She served 3 months in military prison because she is such an ardent advocate for Palestinian human rights. But Israel has decided that the mechanism of providing safety for Jewish people is military deterrence. That is the way that you provide security, is military might. And so the government of Israel promised Jewish people safety and security. But if there's anything to be learned from October 7th, is that doesn't work. Violence begets violence. I just sat on a panel with the foreign minister, Pandor, from South Africa, and she said the longer people struggle for freedom, the more violent the struggle will be. And when you look at Gaza, and you look at Gaza having lived in a blockade, people often call it an open-air prison, the largest open-air prison in the world. And one of my Palestinian friends said, please stop saying that, May. When people go to prison, most of them have been convicted of a crime. And people in Gaza have not been convicted of a crime. This whole idea, how many of you have heard that people in Gaza voted for Hamas? Have you heard that? Well, the majority of people in Gaza right now, 48%, are under the age of 18. So they would have been 2. I can't do math. If Hamas was voted in 2005, they would have been 0? Somewhere between 0 and 2? Someone help me, please, math. They couldn't have voted, right? This idea that 2.3 million people are guilty of the crimes of Hamas is just complete and utter malarkey. So the strategy of the Israeli government has been military deterrence. And in Israel right now, many, many people feel their government has failed them. They made a promise that on October 7th it was broken. And yet the mechanism that is continuing to be employed is military might will bring safety and security. And part of the work that we need to do is to say that that does not work. So that's one option of where Israel can go from here. The second option is ethnic cleansing or genocide. And honestly, if there is not intervention, I mean, we at Churches for Middle East Peace, all 35 of our member communions have said what is happening in Gaza and in the West Bank, in the occupied Palestinian territories, it is unquestionably ethnic cleansing. And many of our groups have said it is clearly genocide. The statistics of famine, the international statistics that just came out, they have said that by mid-July, 100% of the population of Gaza will be experiencing acute hunger by mid-July. Right now, 50% of Gazans are experiencing that degree. The scale is a 1 to 5 point scale. Right now, more than 50% is level 3 or above. By mid-July, 100% will be level 3 or above. So ethnic cleansing or genocide is an option. And the third option is peace. The third option is the only way forward. And peace does not mean kumbaya. Peace does not mean ignoring realities. Peace means negotiated settlement. It means addressing the occupation. It means addressing injustices. It means negotiating a settlement and moving forward together. Peace is the only way forward. So I'll stop there. We have some time for question. We'd ask that you keep it more to a question than a soliloquy, monologue. Yes, but we're happy to hear from you. Yes.
You said you have spoken to the United States government. What has been the response of the Israeli government to any offer on your part? What have they said to you?
So we're a U.S. advocacy organization. I mean, we do meet. Repeat the question. Watching. Yes, the question was, we said that we do advocacy with the American government. Have we met with the Israeli government, and what has their response been? We have historically absolutely met with the Israeli government. We have not since October 7th. We are a US-based advocacy organization, and so as representatives of the United States, we feel like our obligation and power and influence is to advocate with our own government. I can say that, and Tamar can speak to this, particularly in the first weeks in Israel, it was, I'm not going to say illegal because it was not codified into law, but even the word ceasefire was unacceptable. And one of the things that we saw happening in Israel was that Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel, they had to close their shops. You know, we saw Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel, 20%, so there's about 8 million people living in Israel, and 20% are Palestinian citizens. It was described as the way Japanese Americans were treated during World War II. And so one of the dynamics that you've seen is that there's been very, very little room for any conversation in Israel at all on civil society or in the government. The environment has been very, very pro-war, very, very supportive of the bombing of Gaza. And so there's been very, very little room for conversation. Now there are significant protests throughout Israel that are protesting against Netanyahu, that are saying he's actually impeding the hostages being brought home. One of the protests is the family members of hostages actually took the amount of food that the average person in Gaza would have per day, a quarter of a piece of pita, one piece of cheese, and they took it and they gave it to all of the, I don't know if it was the Knesset or the cabinet members, but one of the concerns is that actually hostages, many of them have actually been killed by Israeli airstrikes. They've been killed by the actions of the Israeli government on Gaza. And so the family members are protesting and saying that Netanyahu's impeding negotiations and impeding the return of the hostages.
Do you know if there are any groups in Israel who are Israeli Jews who are also working with their government?
I do know of many peace groups that are calling for a comprehensive ceasefire, that are challenging. There are Combatants for Peace is one of them. It's a group that has Israelis who've laid down their arms, Palestinians who've laid down their arms. That's one group. Bet Salem is another. Yeshdim, I would say they're not working with their government. I would say they're more watchdogs that are challenging their government. I don't know if that's the right term, but yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the dynamic before all this happened, and after 2005? The dynamic between a typical Palestinian in Gaza and Hamas.
Do you want to? Yeah, I can. Yeah. I'll repeat the question.
What's the difference between a Palestinian and the dynamic
The relationship, yeah, the way they.
between Hamas in Gaza and a Palestinian in Gaza? Actually, I'm gonna give it.
No, well, I can actually say, when I was there in 2020, I thought the first thing I would hear from the Palestinians there was the occupation or hatred towards Israel. When I was there in 2020, there was a lot of sentiment that was very anti-Hamas. Now you can't be very vocal, or you couldn't, or there were limitations. Now, it was before October 7th, Hamas has a political wing and a military wing. Hamas is a political party. Now that is very, that distinction is much less clear. Now all of that has been deemed a terrorist group by the United States. That would be the US's perspective, which certainly has been revalidated or reconfirmed after October 7th. The perspective before October 7th was actually that the political wing was a decent bureaucratic government, right? They have nothing. They had very limited resources, no free economy because the borders were completely closed. They're not actual borders, but the entry points were completely closed. The amount of trucks that was allowed in before October 7th was about 500 trucks a day, and there has been research that the amount of nutrients, the amount of actual calories that an individual in Gaza needs were calculated so that Gazans would not be experiencing hunger, but that they would be just below, full health. Thank you. Just below the required daily amount. So 500 trucks was just below that. There's documentation by human rights groups, et cetera, and reports that were released. And so that's what the situation was.
I do want to add, because I have talked to Gazans outside of Gaza, and let's say I met around 10, and none of them said that they do support Hamas. If anything, I clearly remember at least 2 of them hating on Hamas, because sometimes they would get the chance, like you need 3 stamps to leave Gaza, to go to a place. And sometimes they would get the first 2 and they wouldn't get the Hamas stamp if they're doing advocacy things outside of Gaza and all of that. So every time I talk to a friend from Gaza about Hamas, they'd say, no, I don't like Hamas, I don't support Hamas, because they're also kind of sometimes struggling within Gaza because of Hamas. Yeah.
It's important, I think, that, I mean,
Differentiation.
to understand.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have sympathy,
Mm.
but it's good to have understanding.
Yeah, for sure. And I do want to add that for some reason, the media has somehow dehumanized Palestinians in general, either because of Hamas, because of the Arab nature of Palestinians, I don't know, and also Zionist media. So Palestinians are always dehumanized, and one proof to that is that like 240 hostages can be taken, and the whole world would cry about that, versus 33,000 Palestinians, half of which are children, and nobody bats an eye. And now Iran attacks Israel, and again, the whole world is like going crazy, whereas it was a counterattack because Israel attacked first. So again, anything that Israel does is always justified for some reason, but whereas for Palestinians, they can die and nobody just gonna care.
How do you build a coalition for peace? Because, it was this, your third point, when you look at reality on the ground, there isn't anybody but the two of you advocating for peace. Certainly not in the United States House of Representatives, or the Senate, or the White House. It's not in the UN. It's not in the World Court, where it probably ought to be. And there's no advocate, if the Saudis came out and said they were going to be advocates for peace, that might make a difference. But, so how do you start to build that kind of coalition when the difference is so deep?
How do you build a coalition when there's really not a will for it, or where it's not present? It's not present in Congress, it's not present in the White House, et cetera. And I would say I actually believe it is. Maybe not at the top levels, but right below. I mean, we have people pulling us aside on elevators in certain buildings, I won't tell you which ones, saying, thanks for doing what you're doing. I'm with you 100%. Keep doing it, right? And it's more, I can't tell you how many of those whispers we've gotten in multiple buildings, right? There is so much internal will for a way forward. Now, these are not the people at the highest levels right now. They're not. They're not. But there is a will. And I do believe, there are Palestinians, and we shared this, I gave a sermon on October 15th in Boston, and I shared this as the culmination of my service. Suleiman, I think it was, from Combatants for Peace, he said, please, my partners, he's in Combatants for Peace, he's a Palestinian, and he said, and Israelis who'd been a part of the peace movement for decades were going to sign up and join the army. And he was devastated. He said, you have been in the peace movement for decades. This is when it matters. This, right now. Let's put our money where our mouth is. And he was like begging. And he said, I'm reaching out my hand to you. Now, he's not only one. That movement right now, there are protests, and they get squashed, right? They're getting squashed in Israel. But there are people in Israel who are saying, I stand for peace. So that's a Palestinian. I don't know if you've heard the name Vivian Silver. Vivian Silver was killed on October 7th. She was the founder of a group called Women Wage Peace. She was a peace activist. And her son, who lost his mother on October 7th, is one of the leading voices calling for a ceasefire in Israel. If he can do it, we can do it, right?
Yeah, Tamara, you said that we have the power, you don't have the power in Israel. So what would you like from us as individuals? What can we as here do? What, real good actions can we take?
Thank you for asking this question. It's my favorite question. So basically, there's so much you can do. And I always say, outside of CMAP, protests, demonstrations, outside of CMAP, BDS, Boycotting is very important. Now, if we go into CMAP, we do post a lot of statements. There's this statement or letters where we recently posted a letter where you can actually sign your name on it that calls for a ceasefire, release of hostages, disarmament, or like the remove of weapons, US weapons, and all of that. So if you agree with it, you can sign it, and it has been sent internationally and has been in the news as well. You can write op-eds. You can also travel. I say travel a lot now. It's not really related directly to Gaza, but I think it's very important to have people also come and see if you haven't seen what is going on. It's also part of raising awareness. So we're actually doing a trip for international women, and mostly American, to go to Jericho in November this year for the And Still We Rise program, where you get to interact with Palestinian women and just grow together. There's a lot of opportunities, and we have also been doing a ceasefire campaign where people walk 25 miles, or how much is it? Yes, which is the distance between Gaza City and Rafah. And we're adding something to it this time. So instead of walking for no reason, people are walking to their constituents or where change can actually happen. So mainly, the main thing you can actually do, and if you want to do one thing, talk to your representatives. It's very important. You might think it's not, but the more you call them, and the more you talk to them, the more you annoy them, it works.
And we have a phone number on our website where you can go and it says take action, and it'll say call my member of Congress. And if you click it and fill out a form, our number will call you, and the form will give your zip code. So it will identify your representative and your 2 senators, and it will give you some suggested language. And all you have to do is push star, and it will call all 3 of your representatives in a row. And so it's just like that. We say 3 minutes a day. So during Advent, instead of the chocolate a day for the Advent calendar, we did 3 minutes a day, right? And we were calling for a comprehensive ceasefire, a release of hostages on both sides, and immediate and adequate humanitarian assistance into Gaza.
Yes. Thank you for being here this evening with us. There are many in our church that have been very concerned about what's happened with Palestinians for many, many years. There was a woman that I especially followed, and yet I've not heard from her in years now, Hanan Ashrawi.
Oh, yeah.
Is she still?
Yeah, I just saw her.
She's coming to the summit in November for And Still We Rise. We're sent official invitations, and we're trying to figure out the schedule, but there's a 90% chance she will be there.
Yeah, she's. Yeah.
There's still so much work to be done to create a justice system between the West Bank, between Gaza, as you said, they were barely getting enough food to survive the way it was. So there was so much of a problem there. I don't know whether you and your group had then planned, okay, what's the next step? We have a ceasefire, what's the next step?
Yep.
This might be a chance
Yes.
to move towards, we keep talking about a 2-state solution, okay, that sounds good, but how do we get there and how do we move that way?
So we come from the tradition, historically, it used to be in Washington, D.C., if you were not a 2-state solution organization, you couldn't get a meeting. I mean, it was that black and white, And we actually shifted our position 7 years ago or so. I've been the executive director 8 years. We would support any negotiated settlement that allows for equal rights. There's a beautiful statement that has a lot of those types of ideas in it, that Palestinians need to determine the future that they want for themselves, but they need to have equal rights. One of our asks right now is that the core causes of the conflict and that the human rights violations and the oppression be addressed. What that looks like specifically, it gets into the details. And I will just say this because you mentioned two-state solution. We need to be very careful in this moment. The Biden administration keeps saying we support a state of Palestine. Have you heard this? They're talking about two-state solution. And one of the big things is that in October, November, December, all the Arab states are saying ceasefire, ceasefire, stop killing, stop killing. And the West and the US is saying two-state solution. And everybody's going, what is the US talking about? People are dying every day, and you're talking about a two-state solution. The big concern is that the US, I'm calling it lipstick on a pig, and someone said, May, that's a really nice way of putting it, because you slap the name Palestine on an occupied state, and it's the same exact situation that's happening now, and you have not addressed any of the core issues. You haven't addressed settlements, you haven't addressed displacement, you haven't addressed home demolitions, you haven't addressed child detentions, you haven't addressed inequality. I'm out of breath. Would you like for me to keep going? And that's the conversation that's happening right now. So don't be fooled when you hear all of this news about two-state solution. If they're not talking about deconstructing militarization and occupation, then it's not a legitimate conversation.
And I do want to add that in the letter that we posted, we added that occupation part. So it's useless to just address ceasefire and humanitarian aid without addressing the elephant in the room, basically.
I'm taking two examples that you probably know is South Africa and Northern Ireland. And after the chaos was settling down, and I don't think the chaos is settling down in Israel or Palestine, but the leaders they made a design for how that was going to work. And it seems to me that because of all the friction and corruption at the top of the Israeli government, you can't have a design conversation with people when you're asking, when you hear the two-state solution, that's not a constructive conversation that you're calling for.
We're not calling for it.
Well, but you are, in between the lines, you're looking for something that's different than campaigning up the street with signs. You're looking for
No, we campaign up the streets with signs. Guess what I was doing on Good Friday?
I'm afraid to ask.
I don't think there was a question. I don't think there was a question. But he said that we're advocating for a two-state solution, and I said, no, we're not, and then I don't, and he said, well, you're not, walking down the street with signs, and I said, actually, yes, we are. We've had vigils regularly in front of the White House. We call them prayer vigils, and we pray to God, and then we call out to Biden, right? I mean, literally, that's what we do. Literally, pray to God. Biden's birthday, we were praying to God, and then there were maybe chants of shame. I mean, there were, yes. Anyway, but I actually think the mechanisms have to be direct action in terms of calling on your elected officials. There has to also be mobilization in terms of, did you hear what happened yesterday? It was a day of action. The San Francisco Bridge was shut down. The Brooklyn Bridge was shut down. I mean, that type of civil disobedience. And so then I said, do you know where I was on Good Friday? And if you've heard of a little place called Lockheed Martin, I won't tell you the rest of that story because we're being... Yes, it was my first time, so I got arrested for civil disobedience at Lockheed Martin while praying the Lord's Prayer while calling for an end to the militarization of what's happening in Gaza. Oh, thank you.
Let's start up front.
So Peter and then Imam.
Oh, I didn't say.
Yeah, I just saw.
So I think what we struggle with in the capital region, and I think is true across the country, is how do religious people have an inclusive conversation about this, and what are the rules of the road for that kind of conversation? And could we be forgiven if we had our doubts that that was possible?
What is the question?
So my name's Peter Cook, New York State Council of Churches. So what I'm trying to ask is how in our communities can people of different faiths have a conversation about this? And and what strategies would you suggest in this time about how to do that? And could we be forgiven, all of us, for worrying whether that is possible?
I'm going to be honest with you, because it's very hard to have those conversations, especially for Palestinian, doesn't matter Christian, Muslim, but it's very hard to have them, specifically with Jewish Israelis. I don't mind having those conversations with Jewish people in the States. That's easy for me, and I feel like they're more understanding than Jewish Israelis. But I recently made those Israeli connections, and it was almost impossible to have them without both of us getting extremely hurt. And we reached a point where the people who really mattered to me, Israeli, I said, listen, I need my time to process and relax and just like reflect for a little bit. And they needed the same thing. And I lost like 70% of those connections. But there was 30% where I could actually, after 3 months of not talking, even 4 months of not talking fully, I was like, I actually miss that person. And I mean something to them, and they mean something to me. And I was able to make that connection again after. But that's because we had a good relationship from the start, which wasn't easy. It was very, very hard to actually reach that point where I could become friends with Israelis. So I'm just saying it's not impossible, but it took a lot from me and them. Strategies?
Well, in terms of forgiveness, the good thing is I don't think that we're the ones to, to respond to that. So I believe all are welcome to receive forgiveness who ask. So that's good news. I think in terms of strategies, personally, I think it's constructive to have a private strategy and a public strategy. I think that some of the things different groups around the country are seeking to do publicly may backfire significantly and may cause more harm than good because either there's not a relationship there beforehand. I had staff 5 or 6 years ago say, why are you meeting with these people? And I would always say, and it wasn't even necessarily multi-faith relationships. It might be, the ambassador of Oman or something, right? And I said, so that when we're in a position when we need to be having conversations with them, we know one another already. And so if that work has not been done, now is not the time. Now is the most acute time for these types of conversations. And so if you don't have that foundation of relationship, doing some type of public work that's like 500 level, PhD, etc., it's not that it can't be done, it's just that, I said this over lunch today, there are groups that have been teaching this stuff, that are PhDs who their whole professional life is committed to multi-faith engagement, and they're leading conversations that, excuse the expression, are exploding. And these are the experts, right? This is the hardest, most vitriolic moment, the most loaded moment of emotions and feelings and passions. So to try to deal with all of this publicly, I said it's a little bit, and I like going to a therapy session about the most extreme trauma you possibly can experience and trying to do it on a public stage, right? It's really, taking somebody else's clothes off in public. Right? And so I think if things can be done privately And then get the top 5 leaders who can do that work privately, and then have them come out together on a statement, on a letter, on a... Now, that does not mean compromising. Our approach is multi-narrative without compromising on human rights. I mean, we were talking about this today at lunch. People are dying every day. So don't, when you're doing this work, which is some of the most critical work, don't not every day do whatever you can to get the killing to stop, right? Which sometimes compromises that private work. And sometimes the conversations that I have the most constructively behind the scenes, it has to be with people who are willing to accept they know where I am publicly. Now, they may not agree, but they know, right? And so I think actually some of the hard work we have to do is going to be the work that's not going to get us the cover of the New York Times, but it's the work that has to be done behind the scenes that when it's ready to come public is going to be the most valuable.
I agree with you, but everything you're saying about what's happening in the Middle East, I can understand. But I also hear you saying that the root of the problem, at least for us, is us. And we are dealing with a very basic emotion. My father was a medic in the Second World War, and he hauled dead bodies around and picked up massacres and all those kind of things. And when he would talk about it, his answer to me, a 10-year-old boy, was Teddy Roosevelt's answer. The one who's the safest is the one who carries the biggest stick. And that the answer to all your problems is that basic fear that exists in each one of our hearts. So my question to you is, if the church is going to do something, my question is, where does it start? And my feeling is, it starts in the pulpit. What would you suggest to American pastors who want to do something about the horrors that you're putting in front of us? I'm asking for a specific group. He's going to try to change our hearts.
Yeah. I think...
To be quiet. That's what we are. It's quiet.
Yeah.
And that's probably the biggest weakness of the church.
Yes.
Is that it's there, everybody knows it stands for Jesus, but it's quiet.
The question was, what would you say to pastors that the belief is, how should they handle their own churches? So with respect, if we think that the future of America rests in the pulpit, we're in trouble. So I appreciate the question. There are lots of ways to not be silent. There are lots of ways to not be silent. And honestly, a group of people within a church have more power, in my opinion, than a pastor. I really believe that. And I think also a group of people in a church can change the heart of a pastor, which then can change the heart of a church. I mean, I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen on many issues. I went to serve in a church in Northern California, and I came from leading a prison ministry, and it was a very wealthy, affluent church in the East Bay. And they said, "You will never start a prison ministry here in this church." And I left, and I couldn't get the pastors out of San Quentin. Not because they were in prison. Right? And that wasn't from me preaching. I mean, I preached once a month, right? But that was from, and so I'll close with a verse when we close, because I think it speaks to what we each have to do. But whatever your power is, if, you know, that's what the verse, we're going to read Romans 12. Whatever your gift is, if it's teaching, teach. If it's leading, lead. If it's, you know, All you have to do is have a movie night. Have you ever seen, it's on Netflix. It's called The Present. It's 20 minutes. It's literally a snapshot of the occupation. 20 minutes. You can do a 40-minute session on The Present. And it's a dad buying his wife a present and a little girl, and it shows the occupation. I have played that. You want to hear this? I have played that in the biggest church in Colorado Springs with an Israeli flag hanging over my head. And almost every room in the eye, listen to me, I'm making absolutely no sense, and you know what I'm talking about. Right? There is so much you can do. Read a book, watch a movie, come visit the region, have people come speak. The number one thing you can do is write an op-ed in your local paper because your representative has it on their desk every week. Any of you writers? Storytellers? Right? So there are so many things you can do. I think we're about there, yes. Yes.
I agree with reading a piece myself and Samantha at the University of Massachusetts. This means a lot to us, and this event in itself is part of that engagement. So I just wanted to thank you, and just to highlight the fact that you guys are standing here. I know how difficult your work is, so may God bless you. A lot of people don't get to see, they only get to see you to be here, but I think the most difficult part is everything else that we don't see. So on behalf of the Muslim community in the Cap region, Latham, Clinton Park, this Schenectady, Albany, we really appreciate this. And I think this is something that, the faith leaders who are trying to work on that sense of faith, that really believes that every innocent life is sacred. And I think that's one thing that brings all of us together. So we really want to thank you guys. We really appreciate it.
It means a lot, more than anything. Thank you.
So we do want to introduce you to John. Did you want to share a few words, or do you want us to just tell them yes? Okay, and then if I can, I do want to read Romans 12, but I'll do it as a closing prayer. Is that okay? I'll do it as a benediction when we're all done, but you come. This is John. He's our regional coordinator. He can answer any questions you have. He can get your church involved.
He's Superman. He's actually
I just wanted to add to the discussion the question, what can we as individuals do? And someone responded to that question by saying, stop being an individual. Find some people to work with, 2, 3, 4 people in your church, to say, we're going to work on this issue, and we're going to try to educate others and advocate together. And I would encourage you to think about your church becoming a partner church with Churches for Middle East Peace. It involves a contribution of $250 a year and a commitment to work on education and advocacy in your congregation and beyond. And Churches for Middle East Peace will walk with you in that. They have a wealth of resources available on the website for education and advocacy. So they're there to help you do that. And they're looking for partner churches to make a commitment to be working for peace. I also want to say for people in the Reformed Church in America, we have a Facebook group called RCA Middle East Peacemakers. I'm pretty much the only person who posts on that thing, but I would encourage you to look at that, to become a part of it, and to start posting some stuff on it, to have a conversation in our own denomination about this issue. And, yeah, okay.
Do you have a last name and a contact, and do you want them to come and speak?
I am hearing challenged, so someone needs to repeat that.
Just your last name and contact. She wants your name and contact information.
Yeah, that's a question I can answer. It's John, I can give it to you later too, but John Parlberg, email address is jparlberg@gmail.com. Parlberg is RLBERG. I've also recently returned from the West Bank. I was there in March, and I've spoken here at First Schenectady, but if you have a group or your church is interested in having another discussion, I'd be happy to come and be a part of that as well. Oh, and one more thing. The New York State Council of Churches, I'm on the executive committee of the New York State Council of Churches. We're working on planning a solidarity trip to the West Bank in September, especially for church leaders. And that is very, very important for people in Palestine. One of the things we heard when I was there in March was just how grateful they were for the presence, especially of Americans, just to be there. Some of you know of the Tent of Nations, Daoud Nasser. We were there. While we were there, armed settlers came, walked on the property, private property, threatened him. We wondered what would have happened if there had not been an international presence there. So just being there means a lot. So if you're in a position to think about taking a trip to the West Bank, either with Church for Middle East Peace or the New York State Council of Churches or some other group, I really think that that's a very important witness. Quoting Romans 12 again, I appeal to you by the mercies of God to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Don't just make a statement, but get your body over there and stand next to those people who are suffering.
Thank you, John. I neglected in my opening remarks to give thanks and gratitude to Zach Allen, who's been doing all of our sound and video for us tonight. Thank you so much. I want to also reinforce the importance of not being alone in this kind of work. Why do I say that? Well, to quote a very dear friend of mine, he would have said to me, "Solo is dodo." But in all seriousness, those of us who are in this room tonight who took part in the anti-war movement in the 60s and the 70s, walked the line in terms of civil rights movement, and all of the other kinds of movements for peace and justice, know that there are people who will not be fond of your effort and will not be shy about letting you know their feelings. All the more reason to not engage alone, to do it with a friend or more. Thank you all for being here tonight. I am delighted with the amount of turnout that we've had. I look forward to being able to have more evenings and events like this. And now for our closing and our benediction. Thank you. And thank you to our speakers tonight as well.
Thank you. On one of my visits to Gaza, I was welcomed by a family named the Abu al-Noor family. Nasser was a professor at the Islamic University in Gaza. And we helped he and his family be able to get permits for his daughter who had cancer to be able to get into Jerusalem, to be able to get cancer treatment. And he and I would write back and forth, and he would always say, "We say, Alhamdulillah, thanks be to God." And then when his daughter passed away, he said, "May it be as Allah wills it, that God accepts her and forgives her, that we accept the will of God." And I received news at the end of February that Nasser was killed in one of the Israeli bombings. And he showed such hospitality. And I would say the same thing about his death that he said about his daughter's death. May God forgive him and welcome him. And may it be as God wills it. So I remember him with great appreciation, and I'm grateful for his memory. May we be motivated to not allow one more death as we move forward. Romans 12, I won't read the whole passage, but I would encourage you to. It talks about the gifts that we have and using our gifts accordingly. And then it says this: love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love, and honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need and practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of a low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible and as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, "It is mine to avenge, and I will repay," says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. And in doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. In the name of God, amen.